There once stood a city carved into the heart of a volcano, where topless towers pierced clouds heavy with ash and wonder, where dragons by the hundreds darkened the sky like a living storm, their shadows falling across pyramids and palaces that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. This place was called Valyria, and it was the greatest civilization the world had ever known. For 5,000 years it stood, magnificent and terrible, until in a single day of fire and fury, it was wiped from existence. Tonight, we're going to trace the complete history of this impossible empire, from its humble beginnings among shepherds to its apocalyptic end, and discover what lessons it carries for us across the centuries. Long before there were dragons in the sky or Valyrian steel in the hands of lords, there was a people who knew nothing of power or conquest. They were shepherds, simple folk who guided their flocks across the volcanic peninsula that jutted southward into the summer sea. The land they called home was harsh and unforgiving, dominated by a ring of 14 active volcanoes that locals named the 14 Flames. These weren't gentle, sleeping mountains, but rather perpetually active fire peaks that belched smoke and occasionally rivers of molten stone. The shepherds had learned to live in the shadow of these flames, finding the volcanic soil rich enough to support grazing lands, accepting the danger as simply part of existence in this corner of the world. These early Valyrians left little record of their origins, no grand chronicles or carefully preserved histories. What we know comes from fragments mentioned in later texts, stories passed down through countless generations until they took on the quality of myth. They were, by all accounts, an unremarkable people in an age when empires rose and fell across Essos. To the east, the old empire of Giz had already conquered vast territories, building its power on the backs of slave legions and the organizational genius of its ruling class. The Giscari would have looked upon these shepherds, if they looked at all, with nothing but contempt. What threat could the goat herders pose to an empire that had stood for centuries? But the shepherds had something the Giscari did not. Within the 14 Flames, in the deepest volcanic chambers where heat reached unimaginable intensity and toxic fumes could kill a man in seconds, something lived. Perhaps they had always been there, these creatures of fire and scale. Perhaps they were drawn to the volcanoes from some distant place, seeking the heat and the darkness and the isolated sanctity of the flames. The legends don't say how the first shepherd discovered them, but discover them they did. Dragons, not as metaphor or artistic representation, but as living, breathing reality. Creatures with wings that could blot out the sun, with scales harder than any armor yet forged by human hands, with fire in their bellies hot enough to melt stone into flowing glass. Imagine the terror of that first encounter. A shepherd, perhaps seeking a lost animal, or exploring where wisdom said not to go, descending into caverns lit by the red glow of magma, the air shimmering with heat. And there, in a chamber carved by nature, or perhaps by the creatures themselves, dragons, not one but many, ranging from newly hatched things no larger than dogs, to ancient beasts whose very presence would have made the mountain itself seem small. The rational response would have been to flee, to run back to the safety of the surface world, and never speak of what had been seen. But something happened instead. Whether through courage or madness, or perhaps some quality inherent in these particular people, the shepherds did not run. They stayed. They observed. And eventually, slowly, they began to understand. The taming of dragons was not a simple process. It could not have been merely a matter of whips and chains, though these would later play their role. Dragons are not horses to be broken or dogs to be trained through simple reward and punishment. They possess intelligence, perhaps more than humans in some ways, and they will not bend to force alone. The early Valyrians must have discovered this truth through bitter experience, through failed attempts that surely cost lives and perhaps entire settlements. But they persisted, and in that persistence, they made discoveries that would change the course of history. Magic entered the equation. The Valyrians learned, perhaps from contact with travelers from distant Ashai, where sorcery had ancient roots, or perhaps through their own experimentation, that dragons responded to blood and fire, not merely the physical fire of torches and hearths, but something deeper, something that resonated with the fire that burned in the dragons themselves. They developed rituals, spells whose specific nature has been lost to time, but whose effects were undeniable. Through these means, they forged bonds with the dragons, connections that went beyond master and beast into something more fundamental. A dragon would choose its rider, accepting them in a way that seemed almost spiritual. And once that bond was formed, it held for life. The transformation this wrought upon the Valyrian people was not merely political or military, but physical. Whether through long exposure to the dragons, through the magic they practiced, or through some combination of factors that even they might not have fully understood, the Valyrians began to change. Their eyes, once brown or black or green like those of any other people, shifted to purple and violet, colors that seemed to echo the flames they worked with. Their hair lightened to silver and platinum white, giving them an appearance unlike any other culture in the known world. Were these changes gradual, spreading across generations, or did they happen more rapidly to those who worked most closely with the dragons and their magic? The texts don't say, but by the time the Valyrians emerged onto the wider stage of history, they were recognizable not just by their power, but by their very appearance. With dragons at their command, the shepherds were shepherds no more. They began to build, not mere villages or towns, but a city worthy of their newfound status. The city of Valyria rose in the shadow of the 14 flames, and it was unlike anything the world had seen before. The Valyrians had discovered that their magic could be applied not just to living creatures, but to the very stone itself. They did not cut and chisel their buildings as other peoples did, but work stone as if it were clay, shaping it through fire and sorcery into forms that seemed impossible. Towers rose without visible support. Bridges spanned distances that should have required massive pillars, but instead floated on nothing but air and magic. The city was a testament to the marriage of power and artistry, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The establishment of Valyria as a city marked the true beginning of what would become the Valyrian freehold. The shepherds had become dragonlords, and the world would never be the same. They organized themselves not as a kingdom with a single ruler, but as a freehold, a confederation, where all who owned land had a voice in governance. This was, on its surface, a surprisingly democratic arrangement for an ancient civilization. But as with many such systems, the reality proved less egalitarian than the theory. Power gravitated naturally toward those who possessed dragons, and among those dragon lords, certain families rose to prominence through their wealth, their skill with magic, or simply the size and ferocity of the dragons they commanded. Approximately 40 families came to dominate Valyrian society, the great houses of dragon lords whose word carried weight and whose dragons made that word law. These were not kings, not in the traditional sense. but they might as well have been. Among them were families whose names history has forgotten, lost in the destruction that would eventually claim them all. Among them, too, were the Targaryens, who would survive when all others fell, though at this early stage they were far from the most powerful or influential of the dragonlord families. They were respectable, yes, possessed of ancient lineage and their own dragons, but in the great game of Valyrian politics, they were players of middling importance at best. The transformation from shepherds to dragonlords had taken centuries, perhaps longer. It was not a sudden revolution, but an evolution, each generation building upon the discoveries of the last, each adding to the body of knowledge about dragons and magic and power. By the time Valyria emerged as a force that would reshape Essos, the origins as simple herders must have seemed like a distant dream, barely remembered and possibly embellished beyond recognition. But those origins mattered. They established a pattern that would define Valyria throughout its existence. The relentless pursuit of power through the mastery of forces that others feared to touch. The shepherds had dared to enter the 14 Flames and claim what they found there. Their descendants would dare far more, reaching ever deeper into the realms of magic and ambition until they reached too far and fell. The Valyrian freehold, once it had coalesced from a collection of dragonlord families into a coherent political entity, represented something genuinely new in the world. It was not an empire in the traditional sense, with a central emperor whose word was absolute and whose succession determined the fate of nations. Instead, it operated as a confederation of equals, at least in theory. All who held land freely, the lord's freeholder, possessed the right to participate in governance, to have their voices heard in the great decisions that would shape their civilization's future. This was the meaning of freehold, a society where the free-born landholders controlled their own destiny. But theory and practice, as they so often do, diverged sharply. While technically any landholder could participate in governance, the reality was that those who commanded dragons held the true power. The dragonlords, those families who had mastered the art of dragon riding and who maintained their own flights of the great beasts, formed an effective ruling class. They were the ones who mattered when important decisions needed to be made, when wars needed to be waged, when the direction of the freehold required setting. The other landholders could speak, yes, but who would listen to a voice unaccompanied by the roar of dragons? Among the dragon lords themselves, a hierarchy existed based on the number and size of their dragons, the antiquity of their lineage, and their mastery of the sorcerous arts that were integral to Valyrian power. At times, when circumstances demanded unified leadership, the Lord's freeholder would elect archons to serve as temporary supreme leaders. These were not permanent positions, not dynasties that could become entrenched, but rather emergency measures deployed when the freehold faced existential threats or opportunities that required coordinated action. The archons would serve their purpose and then step down, returning power to the collective of dragon lords. It was a system that managed somehow to balance the competing ambitions of dozens of powerful families while still allowing the freehold to act decisively when needed. The heart of Valyrian power, beyond even the dragons themselves, lay in their mastery of magic. The Valyrians were not merely talented sorcerers. They had made magic into a science, a systematic study that permeated every aspect of their civilization. All Valyrian magic, according to the scholar Marwyn, who studied these matters centuries after Valyria's fall, was rooted in blood or fire. These were not mere poetic metaphors but literal truths about the nature of their sorcery. Blood magic, the darkest and most potent form of magical practice, required the sacrifice of living things to fuel its workings. The greater the sacrifice, the more powerful the magic that could be achieved. Fire magic drew upon the primal force of flame, particularly the unique fires that burned in dragons and in the volcanic depths of the 14 flames. The blood mages of Valyria, known as blood mages or maegi, practiced arts that would have been condemned as abominations in most other cultures. They delved into experiments that pushed the boundaries of what was natural and what was perverse. In the flesh pits of Gogossos, a Valyrian colony on the Isle of Tears in the far south, blood mages engaged in acts of such grotesque cruelty that even the limited records that survive speak of them with horror. They would force slave women to mate with beasts, using their magic to ensure that pregnancy resulted from these unions. The offspring, twisted half-human creatures called chimeras, served various purposes in Valyrian society. Some were kept as curiosities, others as slaves for particularly dangerous or demeaning tasks, still others as subjects for further magical experimentation. These practices extended beyond the creation of chimeras. Some scholars, including the renowned Septon Barth, speculated that the Valyrians had used their blood magic to create the dragons themselves, perhaps breeding them from wyverns and other lesser reptiles through sorcerous manipulation over countless generations. Whether this was true, or whether dragons had always existed and the Valyrians had merely learned to tame them, remains a matter of debate. What is certain is that the relationship between Valyrians and their dragons involved magic at a fundamental level. The bond between rider and dragon was not merely a matter of training, but something deeper, forged through rituals that likely involved blood sacrifice and probably death. The most visible and enduring legacy of Valyrian magical prowess was their steel. Valyrian steel became legendary and remained so centuries after the Freehold's destruction, for good reason. Blades forged from this material possess qualities that seem to defy natural law. They are lighter than castle-forged steel, yet harder and stronger. They can hold an edge that never dulls, remaining sharp as the day they were forged even after centuries of use. The metal itself is distinctive, featuring rippled patterns that flow across the surface like water frozen in metal, darker than normal steel, often appearing almost black in certain lights. The creation of Valyrian steel involved both mundane and magical techniques. The steel was folded thousands upon thousands of times, a process that removed impurities and created the distinctive patterns visible in the finished blades. But folding alone could not account for the steel's supernatural properties. Spells were involved, incantations passed down through generations of master smiths, probably requiring blood sacrifice to power them. Dragonfire played a role too, the intense heat necessary to work the metal in ways that normal forges could not achieve. The specific details of the process were closely guarded secrets, even within Valyria, known only to the master smiths who devoted their lives to the craft. When Valyria fell, and the doom claimed the lives of everyone who possessed this knowledge, the secret of creating new Valyrian steel died with them. Only one place in all the world retained even partial knowledge of the art, the free city of Qohor. The smiths of Qohor could rework existing Valyrian steel, melting down swords to create new ones, or repairing damaged blades, but even they could not create entirely new steel from raw materials. Meister Pol, determined to uncover the secrets of Qohoric smithcraft, spent years studying their methods. He was publicly whipped 3 times for asking too many questions and finally expelled from the city with his hand cut off. According to his later writings, the Qohoric smiths used blood sacrifice in their attempts to replicate true Valyrian steel, including the sacrifice of infant slaves. Whether this was the actual Valyrian method or merely the Qohoric's best approximation remains unknown. The creation of Valyrian steel represented just one application of their magical knowledge. They possessed glass candles, objects made from obsidian that burned with a strange light and served as tools of immense power. With these candles, a skilled sorcerer could see across mountains and oceans, could peer into the dreams of men hundreds of miles away, could speak mind to mind with others who possessed similar candles. The glass candles went dark after the Doom, their flames extinguished when Valyria fell, adding to the evidence that somehow the city itself had been the source or focal point of the magic that permeated the freehold. The capital city reflected this magical mastery in every aspect of its construction. According to King Viserys I Targaryen, who became obsessed with Valyrian history and spent years building a scale model of the city based on historical records, Old Valyria was built partially inside an active volcano. The highest nobles lived in structures carved into or built against the volcanic face itself, presumably protected by magical wards that allowed them to live in comfort mere yards from molten rock. At the heart of the city stood a building called the Anogrian, where the blood mages practiced their arts. What exactly transpired within the Anogrian can only be imagined, but it must have been a place of tremendous power and possibly tremendous horror. The topless towers of Valyria, mentioned in songs and histories with a mixture of wonder and melancholy, were just one of the architectural marvels that defined the city. These towers rose to heights that seemed to defy structural possibility, their peaks lost in clouds and smoke from the surrounding volcanoes. They required no visible buttresses or supports, standing through some combination of sophisticated engineering and magical reinforcement. Sphinxes, not the traditional lion-bodied creatures of mythology, but rather dragon-bodied beings with human faces, served as decorative elements throughout the city. These may have been purely artistic, or they may have served some magical purpose, perhaps as wards or guardians imbued with protective spells. Roads connected Valyria to other cities within the freehold, and these were not simple dirt paths, but rather sophisticated constructions, many carved directly from volcanic rock or paved with stones fitted so precisely that no mortar was needed. These dragon roads, as they came to be called, allowed for rapid movement of troops, goods, and information throughout the freehold's territories. They were another demonstration of the Valyrian philosophy: do nothing by half measures, make everything a reflection of power and permanence. The government structure, despite its theoretically democratic foundations, evolved into something closer to an oligarchy, where the dragonlord families competed constantly for influence and resources. There were approximately 40 major dragonlord houses, each with their own dragons, their own magical secrets, their own ambitions. These families formed and broke alliances, married across houses to combine bloodlines and dragons, engaged in feuds that sometimes lasted generations. It was a Game of Thrones long before that phrase would be applied to Westeros, with similar stakes and similar brutality. The difference was that in Valyria, The game was played with weapons that could burn cities and powers that could twist flesh and stone. The Targaryens occupied a middling position in this hierarchy. They were old blood, respectable, with their own flight of dragons, but they were far from the most powerful or influential houses. In the councils of the dragonlords, Targaryen voices were heard, but not necessarily heeded. There, dragons were formidable, but not the largest or most numerous. Their lands were adequate, but not vast. They were, in short, survivors rather than conquerors, a family that understood how to persist through the ages without attracting the dangerous attention of more powerful rivals. This characteristic, this ability to recognize when discretion served better than ambition, would ultimately save them when all other dragonlord families perished. The culture that developed in the freehold was complex and contradictory. They valued freedom for themselves while keeping countless others in chains. They created beauty while committing atrocities. They pushed the boundaries of knowledge while refusing to recognize moral boundaries. The Valyrians practiced customs that other cultures found shocking or disgusting. They permitted polygamy, with dragonlords often taking multiple wives. More controversially, they practiced incest, frequently marrying brother to sister or other close relatives. This practice stemmed partly from their belief that their blood, the blood that allowed them to bond with dragons, needed to be kept pure. To dilute it through marriage to lesser folk would be to risk losing the abilities that made them special. The discovery and taming of dragons transformed the Valyrians from obscure shepherds into a people with the capacity to reshape the world. But capacity is not destiny. The path from local power to continental empire required something more: the will to use that power and the wars to prove it. The first great test of Valyrian might came from the east, from an empire that had stood for thousands of years and saw itself as the rightful ruler of all civilized lands. This was the old empire of Guise, and the clash between Guise and Valyria would determine the fate of Essos for millennia to come. Old Guise was ancient when Valyria was young. Built upon the foundations of slavery and military discipline, the Giscari had conquered vast territories, establishing an empire that stretched across much of eastern Essos. Their capital, Old Guise, was protected by brick walls that legend attributed to Grasdan the Great, the semi-mythical founder of their civilization. These walls had never fallen, had stood against siege and assault for centuries, had become symbols of Giscari permanence and power. Their military prowess was legendary, with slave legions drilled to absolute obedience and tactical perfection. The Giscari looked out across their domains and saw no equals, only subjects and soon-to-be subjects. When the Valyrians began expanding beyond their peninsula, establishing colonies and asserting control over trade routes, the Giscari viewed this with the disdain that old powers reserve for upstart newcomers. Who were these people to challenge the order that Guise had established? The Giscari sent armies to put the Valyrians in their place, to remind them that the world already had masters and they were not among them. Thus began the first of the Giscari Wars, conflicts that would be waged over centuries and would ultimately doom one of the two great powers. The Giscari had every reason to be confident. They had numbers, organization, centuries of military tradition, control of strategic positions. What they did not have, what they could not conceive of as a decisive factor, were dragons. The first war must have been a revelation and a nightmare. Giscari legions, among the finest infantry in the world, marched in perfect formation against the Valyrian positions. And then the dragons came, not from the front where armies engage each other, not from the sides where cavalry might flank, but from above where no shield wall could reach. Imagine the horror of that first engagement from the Giscari perspective. The sky darkening with wings, the roar of dragons drowning out the commands of officers, and then the fire. Dragon fire burns hotter than any natural flame, hot enough to melt stone, certainly hot enough to reduce men in armor to ash in seconds. The legendary discipline of the Giscari legions broke. How could it not? They were being asked to stand firm while literally burning alive, while their comrades turned to torches around them, while the very air became too hot to breathe. The Valyrians won the first war, not through superior tactics or greater courage, but through the application of overwhelming force from a vector the Giscari had no way to counter. But the Giscari were not a people to accept defeat easily. They had built their empire through persistence and adaptation, and they applied these qualities to the problem of dragons. The Second War saw them attempting new strategies, covered formations that might resist fire from above, giant crossbows that could potentially bring down a dragon, magical defenses provided by their own sorcerers. None of it worked. The dragons were simply too powerful, too mobile, too numerous. The Valyrians won the Second War, then the Third, then the Fourth. Each time, the Giscari rebuilt, driven by pride and fury, and the unwillingness to accept that their ancient supremacy had ended. Each time, the dragons burned them again. The wars were not confined to the mainland. They spread to the Giscari colonies throughout the region. In the Third War, the Valyrians conquered Gorgai, the main Giscari base in the Basilisk Isles, renaming it Gogossos and turning it into one of their own colonies. In the Fourth War, they took Zamatar, the only major city the Giscari had established on the mainland of Sorthorios, that mysterious and disease-ridden continent to the south. The Valyrians were systematically dismantling everything the Giscari had built over millennia. The fifth and final war was not about conquest, but annihilation. The Valyrians had decided that merely defeating Giz was insufficient. They would ensure there could never be a sixth war, that the threat from Old Giz would be eliminated permanently and completely. The dragonlords gathered their forces and marched on the Giscari capital itself. The great brick walls that had stood for centuries, that had never been breached, that embodied Giscari power and permanence, were no match for concentrated dragonfire. The walls crumbled, melted, collapsed into rubble. But the Valyrians did not stop with breaching the walls. They burned the city. Every pyramid, every temple, every home was given over to dragonflame. The colossal structures that had defined Old Giz for thousands of years were reduced to slag and ash. When the fires finally died and the dragons departed, nothing remained but a field of destruction that stretched as far as the eye could see. And even this was not enough for the Valyrians. They sowed the fields around Old Giz with salt, lime, and skulls. Salt to ensure nothing would grow there again, rendering the fertile lands barren. Lime to make the soil toxic. And skulls, the skulls of the defeated, as a warning to any who might think to rebuild. The survivors of Old Giz, those who had not died in the siege or the burning, were enslaved. The Valyrians had observed that the Giscari built their power on slavery, and in a twist of irony that must have been deliberate, they decided to adopt this practice themselves. The defeated Giscari were put to work in the mines of the 14 Flames, laboring in conditions so brutal that death often came as a mercy. Over the generations that followed, these slaves and their descendants forgot their own language, forgot their own history, forgot everything except that they had once been something greater and had fallen. They learned to speak High Valyrian, the language of their conquerors, because knowing no other tongue was possible. 3 cities survived from the old empire: Astapor, Meereen, and Yunkai, located on Slavers Bay. These were allowed to continue existing, not out of Valyrian mercy, but because they were useful. They would serve as the primary slave markets for the region, providing the endless stream of human labor that the Valyrian economy demanded. The Giscari heritage in these cities survived only in fragments, in certain architectural styles, in a few traditions, in the practice of slavery itself. But the great civilization that had ruled for millennia was gone, destroyed so thoroughly that it would never rise again. The Giscari Wars established several patterns that would define the Valyrian freehold throughout its existence. First, they demonstrated that the Valyrians would use overwhelming force to achieve their objectives, showing no mercy to enemies who refused to submit. Second, they showed that dragons were the ultimate military asset, capable of winning wars that conventional forces could not. Third, and perhaps most ominously, they showed that the Valyrians were willing to commit genocide to secure their position. The destruction of Old Giz was not merely a military victory, but a conscious decision to erase an entire civilization from history. Having conquered the east, the Valyrians turned their attention westward. For a time, they coexisted peacefully with the Rhoynar civilization that flourished along the Rhoyni, one of the mightiest rivers in the known world. The Rhoynar were an advanced culture in their own right, with powerful water magic and sophisticated cities. The Valyrians established trading posts along the river, initially small settlements that posed no threat to Rhoynar independence. Both civilizations benefited from this arrangement, with Valyrian goods flowing through Rhoynar markets and Rhoynar culture influencing the Valyrian colonies. But what began as peaceful trade evolved into something more ambitious. The Valyrian outposts grew into towns, then into cities. The Valyrians, particularly those of the colony of Volantis, began eyeing the Rhoynar territories with covetous eyes. As conflicts over trade rights and territorial boundaries increased, small skirmishes escalated into larger battles, and larger battles eventually became full-scale war. The Rhoynish Wars, as they came to be called, would last for generations and would end with the effective destruction of Rhoynar civilization and the greatest military response Valyria had ever mounted. The Rhoynar princes initially fought separately, each defending his own city-state. Princess Nymeria of Nisar argued for a united response, warning that divided they would fall to the dragonlords one by one. But her counsel went unheeded. The princes believed their water magic and their military prowess would be sufficient to handle the Valyrian colonies. They won some early victories, proving that they were not easy prey. But then the freehold itself took notice. Prince Garin of Croyan emerged as the great Rhoynar hero, the leader who finally united the fractured city-states into a single military force. He assembled an army of 250,000 men, an absolutely massive force by any standard. This army marched to meet the Valyrians, achieving victory after victory. At Celeris, they defeated a Valyrian army. At Valissar, they won again. At Volontheris, they achieved their greatest triumph, defeating an army of 100,000 men and, most impressively, killing 2 dragons in the process and wounding a 3rd. It seemed, for a brief moment, that the Rhoynar might actually win, that Prince Garen had found the way to overcome the dragonlords. The Valyrian response was overwhelming. They could not allow even the possibility that they might be defeated, could not permit other subject peoples to see that the dragonlords could be beaten. The freehold mobilized not 3 dragons, as had fought at Volontheris, but 300. Some accounts say more than 300, that the sky was so filled with dragons that the sun itself was obscured. This was the full might of Valyria, unleashed, and nothing could stand against it. The final battle was not a battle, but a slaughter. Prince Garen's army, which had fought so bravely and won such victories, was immolated. 300 dragons attacking in concert created an inferno that turned the rivers themselves to steam. The heat was so intense that men died before the flames even touched them, their lungs seared by breathing the superheated air. Prince Garen himself was captured and forced to watch as his army burned and his people died. The Valyrians caged him and displayed him like an animal, a warning to all who might resist their power. According to legend, Garen called down a curse upon the dragonlords before he died, a curse that some believe eventually manifested as the Doom itself. Princess Nymeria, who had warned of this outcome, gathered what remained of her people. The survivors were mostly women, children, and the elderly. Almost all the fighting men had died with Garen's army. She loaded them onto ships, a fleet that legend numbers at 10,000 vessels, and led them in an exodus from their homeland. The Wasi sailed for years, seeking a place where they might rebuild far from the reach of Valyrian power. Eventually, they found sanctuary in Dorne, the southernmost region of Westeros, where Princess Nymeria married Mors Martell and helped establish the united Dorne that would endure for centuries. The Rhoynish Wars ended as the Giscari Wars had, with Valyrian victory and the destruction of an ancient civilization. The great Rhoynar cities along the Rhine were burned or abandoned. Their magnificent water gardens turned to ruins. Their temples crumbled. The river that had been the center of their civilization still flowed, but the people who had made it great were gone, scattered or dead or enslaved. The Valyrians built new colonies on the ruins of Rhoynar cities, and in time, the very memory of the Rhoynar and Essos faded to legend and scattered ruins. These wars established the Valyrian freehold as the uncontested power of Essos. From the Giscari colonies in the east to the ruins of the Ki Rhoynar in the west, all acknowledged Valyrian supremacy or were destroyed. The dragons had proven themselves invincible, and the dragonlords had shown they would stop at nothing to maintain their dominance. The century after the Rhoynish Wars represented the absolute peak of Valyrian power, the moment when they controlled more territory, commanded more dragons, and wielded more influence than they ever would again. But peaks are followed by descents, and the Valyrians, in their pride and their power, could not see that their descent was approaching. At its zenith, the Valyrian freehold stretched across distances that would take months to traverse, encompassing territories on multiple continents and asserting control over peoples and cultures from the Basilisk Isles in the south to the borders of the Forest of Qohor in the north. The empire, though they did not call it such, covered most of the western portion of Essos, all the lands from the Bone Mountains to the Narrow Sea and beyond. It was the largest continuous political entity the world had ever seen, and it maintained this vast domain not through administrative genius alone, but through the ever-present threat of dragonfire. The free cities, those great urban centers that still endure in the present day, began their existence as colonies of the freehold. Volantis was among the first and greatest of these, established as a forward base for Valyrian expansion into the lands of the Rhoyne. Lys, Maia, Tyrosh, Pentos, and others followed, each serving specific economic or strategic purposes within the larger Valyrian system. These cities were Valyrian in culture and governance, though they developed their own local characteristics over time. The ruling classes spoke High Valyrian and often included actual dragonlord families or their lesser relatives. The cities were connected to the capital and to each other through the famous dragon roads, those straight and perfectly constructed highways that allowed for rapid movement of troops and trade. Qorhor and Norvos, founded in regions farther from the capital, served different purposes. Qorhor, deep in the forests, became famous for its timber and later for its smiths, who apparently learned some secrets of metalworking from Valyrian masters. Norvos, in the hills to the north, provided metals and served as a buffer against the wild lands beyond. Each colony enriched the freehold, sending tribute and resources back to the capital, while benefiting from the protection and prestige that came with being part of the greatest civilization of the age. Even Braavos, that most independent-minded of the free cities, began as a Valyrian creation, though not an intentional one. Braavos was founded by escaped slaves who stole ships and fled into the foggy islands north of the Valyrian colonies, hiding their city for over a century before revealing its existence. The fact that they needed to hide for so long speaks to the thoroughness of Valyrian control. One did not simply escape the freehold and establish a new life elsewhere. The dragons would find you, and punishment would be severe. The island of Dragonstone represented the westernmost extent of Valyrian expansion, a fortress colony established on a massive rock in the narrow sea, roughly 200 years before the Doom. Dragonstone was strange even by Valyrian standards, carved from the black volcanic stone of the island into forms that resembled dragons in every chamber and tower. It served as a monitoring station, allowing the freehold to keep watch on the lands of Westeros across the water. But the Valyrians never attempted to conquer the Seven Kingdoms, and scholars have debated why ever since. Westeros had resources, certainly. It had timber and iron and fertile farmland, all things that an expanding empire could use. But it was also distant, relatively poor by Valyrian standards, and conquering it would have required significant investment of resources for uncertain return. The most likely explanation is that the dragonlords simply never saw Westeros as worth the effort. They had more pressing concerns closer to home, more valuable territories to exploit, more worthy enemies to crush. Westeros was a backwater, and backwaters could wait. Daily life in the city of Valyria itself would have been unlike anything else in the known world. The capital was home to perhaps hundreds of thousands of people, though exact population figures were never recorded or did not survive the Doom. The city was divided into distinct districts based on social status and function. The highest nobility, those dragon lord families with the most power and prestige, lived in the structures built closest to the volcanic face itself. These were not merely homes but palaces, carved directly into the mountain or built against it, protected by magical wards that prevented the heat and toxic fumes from harming the inhabitants. The architecture throughout the city reflected the Valyrian, philosophy of demonstrating power through physical grandeur. Buildings did not merely house people, they made statements. The topless towers pierced the smoke-filled sky, their peaks lost in the clouds and volcanic ash that perpetually hung over the city. Bridges connected structures across impossible distances, appearing to float on nothing but air, held aloft by magic and engineering that even the Valyrians' own descendants could not replicate. Sphinxes with dragon bodies and human faces lined the grand boulevards, their eyes set with garnets that seemed to glow in the light of the numerous fires that burned throughout the city. At the city's heart stood the Targaryen, the great structure where the blood mages performed their most powerful and most terrible rituals. What exactly happened within the Targaryen remains largely unknown, as those who entered its halls either kept its secrets or did not survive to share them. It was likely here that the darkest experiments took place, where the boundaries between human and beast were deliberately blurred, where sacrifices were made to fuel spells of immense power. The Targaryen represented the heart of Valyrian sorcery, and it would have been heavily guarded and restricted, with only the most powerful blood mages granted entry. The city contained forges unlike any others, where master smiths worked Valyrian steel using techniques that combined metallurgy with magic. The forges were fueled by dragonfire when necessary, creating temperatures that no normal fire could achieve. The smiths were highly valued craftsmen, their skills passed down through generations within specific families. A master smith might spend his entire life perfecting the art of folding steel and infusing it with the spells that gave Valyrian steel its legendary properties. The forges were places of intense heat, dangerous work, and occasional spectacular failure when a spell went wrong or a piece of steel shattered during the forging process. Markets filled entire districts where goods from across the freehold's vast territories were bought and sold. Silks from the east competed with timber from the forests of Qorhor. Slaves from Slavers Bay stood in pens next to captured animals from Sothorios. Spices, gems, rare metals, exotic foods, all flowed into Valyria as tribute or trade. The markets would have been polyglot places where High Valyrian mixed with dozens of other languages, where fortunes were made and lost in single transactions, where merchants from distant lands came to trade and marveled at the wealth and wonders on display. The practice of slavery permeated Valyrian society, adopted from their defeated enemies in Guise and expanded into something even more extensive and brutal. Slaves performed all the hard labor that kept the city functioning. They worked in the forges, though only the most skilled were trusted with actual metalworking. They served in the great houses as servants, accountants, tutors for children, even as concubines. But the greatest number of slaves labored in the mines beneath the 14 flames, extracting the gold, silver, and other precious materials that fueled Valyrian wealth. The nobility engaged in pursuits befitting their status. They practiced the arts of dragon riding, a skill that required training from childhood and was considered the mark of true aristocracy. They studied magic, either personally, if they had the talent, or by employing blood mages who could perform spells on their behalf. They engaged in the complex political games that defined high society, forming and breaking alliances, arranging marriages, feuding with rival families, scheming to increase their own power and prestige. It was a life of luxury built upon foundations of slavery and magic, beautiful to those who benefited from it, horrific for those who did not. The wealth flowing into Valyria was staggering. Every colony paid tribute. every conquered people sent a portion of their production. The Yaun mines operated constantly, their slave labor producing gold and silver in quantities that would have made them the richest civilization in the world, even without their other advantages. This wealth funded further expansion, more dragons, more magic, more of everything that made them powerful. It created a cycle where power generated wealth, which generated more power, seemingly without end. But this golden age, this period when Valyria seemed invincible and eternal, contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. The very practices that made them powerful, their reckless use of blood magic, their constant mining that destabilized the volcanic systems beneath their city, their absolute certainty that their power could overcome any threat. All of these were preparing the ground for catastrophe. In their pride, the Valyrians could not imagine that their civilization might end. They were the masters of dragons, the greatest sorcerers the world had known, the rulers of half the known world. How could such a civilization fall? To understand the Valyrian freehold completely, one must confront the darkness at its core. This was not a civilization of benign philosophers who stumbled upon power and used it wisely. The Valyrians deliberately embraced practices that other cultures would consider abominations, pursuing knowledge and power regardless of moral cost. Their magic, their very civilization, was built upon the foundations of blood and suffering that make many of their accomplishments morally compromised at best and utterly monstrous at worst. All Valyrian sorcery, as noted by the Archmeister Marwyn centuries after the Doom, was rooted in blood or fire. This was not mere metaphor, but literal truth about how their magic functioned. Blood magic, the most powerful and most dangerous form of sorcery known to the world, requires the sacrifice of living things to fuel its workings. The more significant the sacrifice, the greater the power that can be achieved. A small spell might require the blood of an animal. Greater workings would demand human sacrifice. The most powerful spells, those that could alter fundamental reality or create lasting changes, required massive sacrifices performed with exacting ritual precision. The blood mages of Valyria were masters of this dark art. They could see the future, though imperfectly and often ambiguously. They could curse enemies, sending misfortune or disease or madness across any distance. They could create magical objects imbued with power that would last beyond their own lifetimes. They could, most terribly, manipulate flesh itself, twisting living creatures into new forms that served Valyrian purposes. These were not merely talented individuals, but a class of sorcerers who had systematized blood magic, turning it from scattered practices into a disciplined field of study. The blood mages were not necessarily identical with the dragonlords, though there was overlap between the two groups. Some dragonlords possessed significant magical ability and could perform blood magic themselves. Others employed blood mages to handle the sorcerous aspects of dragon riding and other tasks. Not all blood mages were of the highest nobility. Some came from lesser families, their magical talent elevating them to positions of influence they could not have achieved through birth alone. This created an interesting dynamic where magical ability could partly offset the rigid social hierarchies that otherwise defined Valyrian society. The flesh pits of Gogossos represent perhaps the most disturbing application of Valyrian blood magic. Gogossos was a Valyrian colony on the Isle of Tears, far to the south in the Summer Sea. It became the site of experiments that pushed the boundaries of what civilized people can even contemplate. The blood mages in Gogossos force slave women to mate with beasts, using their magic to ensure that pregnancy resulted and that the offspring survived. The creatures born from these unions, the chimeras, were twisted things that combined human and animal features in ways that should not have been possible. What purpose did these chimeras serve? The texts don't provide complete answers, but we can make educated guesses. Some were probably kept as curiosities, living demonstrations of Valyrian magical prowess. Others may have been bred for specific purposes, combining human intelligence with animal strength or specific abilities. Still others were likely subjects for further experimentation, raw material for blood mages seeking to understand the limits of what flesh could be forced to become. The practice itself speaks to a fundamental callousness about life and suffering, viewing living beings as merely raw materials to be shaped according to Valyrian will. Beyond the chimeras, there is evidence that the Valyrians experimented with creating or modifying other life forms. Septon Barth, one of the most learned men to study Valyrian lore, speculated in his dragons, worms, and wyverns, their unnatural history, that the blood mages might have used wyvern stock to create dragons. This is controversial, as many believe dragons existed naturally before the Valyrians discovered them, but the possibility that dragons themselves might be products of Valyrian blood magic cannot be dismissed. The creatures are simply too perfect for their purpose, too ideally suited to serve as weapons and tools of intimidation. Did the Valyrians find dragons, or did they create them? The answer died with the Doom. The spells required for binding dragons to riders almost certainly involved blood magic. The bond between dragon and rider was not merely a matter of training from a young age, though that was certainly part of it. Something deeper occurred during the bonding process, something that linked the dragon's consciousness to the riders in ways that persisted until one or both died. This probably required ritual sacrifice, possibly even human sacrifice, to forge. The willingness of dragons to accept riders only from specific bloodlines suggests that something hereditary was involved, some quality in the blood that made bonding possible. The creation of Valyrian steel, while primarily a matter of smithcraft, also involved magical spells that almost certainly drew upon blood magic. The master smiths of Qohor, centuries after the Doom, were discovered by Maester Pol to be sacrificing infant slaves in their attempts to replicate true Valyrian steel. Whether this was the actual Valyrian method, or merely the Qohoric smith's best guess at replicating it, remains unclear, but the fact that it was their approach suggests they believed blood sacrifice to be integral to the process. The steel was folded and worked with dragon fire, yes, but the spells that gave it supernatural properties required fuel, and blood magic provides that fuel. The glass candles represented another application of Valyrian sorcery, one that was less overtly violent, but no less magical. These objects, made from obsidian and worked through means that are no longer understood, burned with a strange light that never consumed them. A trained sorcerer using a glass candle could perform feats that seem impossible, seeing across mountains and oceans, entering and influencing another person's dreams, communicating instantly with someone on the opposite side of the world who possessed another lit candle. These were tools of incredible power, giving the Valyrians advantages in intelligence gathering and coordination that no other civilization could match. After the Doom, all the glass candles went dark simultaneously. This suggests that they were somehow dependent upon Valyria itself, or upon the concentration of a magical power that existed there. When that power was destroyed, the candles ceased to function. It was only centuries later, when magic began returning to the world following the birth of Daenerys Targaryen's dragons, that the glass candles lit once more. This connection between dragons and magical power seems fundamental to understanding Valyrian sorcery. The dragons were not merely weapons but sources or focal points of magical energy that enabled other workings. The Valyrians' approach to magic was fundamentally different from other magical traditions. The warlocks of Qarth sought mystical understanding through their House of the Undying, using drugs and meditation to achieve altered states of consciousness. The Red Priests of Arhlor claimed to channel the power of their god through prayer and ritual. The Green Seers of the Children of the Forest connected to the Weirwood network through communion with nature. But the Valyrians approached magic as a science, something to be systematized and controlled, bending it to their will through blood sacrifice and careful ritual. This systematic approach to magic made them incredibly powerful, but also incredibly dangerous to themselves and others. They pushed boundaries that perhaps should not have been pushed. They delved into secrets that some traditions say should have remained hidden. The Septons of the Faith of the Seven, writing centuries after the Doom, often claimed that the Valyrians were punished by the gods for their hubris and their sins. Whether one accepts this theological explanation or not, there is something to be said for the idea that the Valyrians reached too far, that their reckless experimentation with forces they did not fully understand contributed to their eventual destruction. The moral implications of Valyrian magical practices cannot be ignored when assessing their civilization. They achieved wonders, yes. They created Valyrian steel, tamed dragons, built a city that defied architectural possibility. But these achievements were purchased with the blood and suffering of countless individuals who had no choice in the matter. The slaves who died in the mines, the women forced to mate with beasts in Gogossos, the people sacrificed to fuel spells, all of these were victims of Valyrian ambition. The civilization that produced such beauty and such power was also capable of casual cruelty on a scale that staggers the imagination. This darkness, this willingness to embrace horror in pursuit of power, defined Valyria as much as their dragons or their steel. It made them feared not just for their military might, but for their fundamental otherness, their apparent absence of the moral restraints that limited other civilizations. When the Doom came, when Valyria burned and sank beneath the waves, many who had suffered under Valyrian rule must have seen it as justice, as the gods or fate or simple cosmic balance finally bringing the dragonlords to account for their sins. Whether this interpretation is correct or merely a comforting narrative imposed after the fact, it speaks to how Valyria was perceived by those who lived in its shadow. As powerful and magnificent, yes, but also as fundamentally wrong. A civilization that had sold its soul for power and would eventually pay the price. Beneath the grandeur of Valyria, beneath the topless towers and the magical wonders, beneath the dragons and the glory, lay a foundation built on suffering beyond measure. The mines of the 14 Flames were the engine that drove Valyrian wealth, the source of the gold and silver and precious materials that funded their expansion and enabled their magical works. But these mines were also charnel houses where slaves died by the thousands, laboring in conditions so brutal that death often came as a release rather than a tragedy. To understand Valyria completely, one must descend into these depths and confront the price that was paid for their magnificence. The 14 Flames were a ring of active volcanoes surrounding the Valyrian peninsula, perpetually smouldering mountains that belched smoke and occasionally erupted with devastating force. Within these mountains lay extensive networks of tunnels and chambers, some natural, many excavated by slave labor over centuries. The Valyrians had discovered that the volcanic regions contained exceptionally rich deposits of precious metals, far more concentrated than could be found elsewhere. Gold and silver, but also other rare materials useful in magical workings, lay deep within the earth, waiting to be extracted. Extracting these materials required digging deeper and deeper into the mountains, following veins of ore through solid rock, working in chambers where the heat alone was almost unbearable. The Valyrians used slaves for this labor, initially captured prisoners from their wars with geese, later supplemented by victims of their other conquests and by individuals born into slavery. The scale of this operation was staggering. Estimates, insofar as they can be made from fragmentary sources, suggest that hundreds of thousands of slaves labored in the mines over the centuries, possibly millions over the entire history of the freehold. The conditions these slaves endured defy adequate description. The heat in the lower levels was intense enough to kill within hours for those unaccustomed to it. The air was thick with toxic fumes from volcanic gases, vapors that could burn lungs or cause slow poisoning. Slaves worked with minimal tools, often just picks and hammers, breaking rock by hand and hauling it back to the surface through narrow, treacherous passages. Accidents were constant. Tunnels collapsed, burying workers alive. Slaves fell into underground lakes of magma. The fumes overcame workers who dropped dead in the passages. Guards, themselves often slaves promoted to this role, drove the workers with whips and worse, for the Valyrian overseers demanded constant production and cared nothing for the lives of the workers. Beyond the ordinary dangers of mining in volcanic regions, the slaves faced another threat that was uniquely terrifying: fireworms. These creatures, related to dragons but lacking wings or legs, were serpentine beasts that dwelled in the deepest, hottest chambers of the mountains. A fireworm could grow to immense size, rivaling dragons in length though not in wingspan. They generated intense heat from their bodies, burning hot enough that they could tunnel through solid rock by melting it, leaving behind passages of hardened glass. They breathed fire, perhaps even hotter than dragon flame, and they were aggressive, attacking anything that entered their territory. Slaves mining in the 14 Flames regularly encountered fireworms, and these encounters almost never ended well for the slaves. A fireworm could burst through a tunnel wall without warning, incinerating everyone in the passage before they could even think to run. Burnt and blackened corpses were routinely discovered in shafts where the rock showed signs of melting, or where it was cracked and full of holes, evidence that a fireworm had passed nearby. The Valyrian overseers apparently made no great effort to hunt or eliminate the fireworms, perhaps because they considered the creatures too dangerous. Perhaps because they simply didn't care about slave casualties enough to bother. The slaves had to work around the threat, learning to recognize the signs of fireworm activity and hoping they would be lucky enough to avoid encounter. Slave revolts in the mines were common, which speaks to how desperate the conditions must have been. Revolting in a Valyrian mine was almost certainly suicidal. The slaves had limited weapons, no dragons, no magic, and nowhere to run, even if they somehow managed to overcome the guards. But people will reach a point where even hopeless rebellion seems preferable to continued suffering. and that point was reached repeatedly in the volcanic depths. The Valyrians had the resources to put down these revolts, sending in dragonlords when necessary to incinerate rebellious slaves by the hundreds. The blood mages could use their sorcery to break wills and instill terror, creating examples from ringleaders that would discourage future uprisings. The mining operation was so extensive, the death toll so massive, that multiple sources state the number of those who died in the Valyrian mines defies comprehension. This is not mere hyperbole. Over 5,000 years of active mining, extracting ever more material to feed ever greater ambitions, the cumulative death toll could easily have reached the millions. Each generation of slaves fed into the machine, producing the wealth that elevated Valyria above all other nations, while themselves perishing in darkness and fire. Their bones lay in the depths, unnamed and unremembered, the foundation upon which splendor was built. The need for constant replacement of this slave labor force drove much of Valyrian foreign policy. Wars provided fresh captives. The defeat of Guise alone must have supplied tens or hundreds of thousands of slaves for the mines. The Rhoynish Wars added more. Smaller conquests and raids throughout the freehold's territories ensured a steady supply. When there was no war, the Valyrians bred their slaves, treating them as livestock to be managed for maximum production. Women who proved particularly fertile might be specifically encouraged or forced to bear more children, knowing those children would eventually descend into the mines, just as they had. The economic logic was simple, if morally abhorrent. The mines produced wealth. The wealth funded expansion and magnificence. The expansion produced more slaves to work the mines. It was a self-reinforcing cycle, at least as long as the supply of conquerable territory held out, and as long as the geological conditions remained stable. The Valyrians saw no reason to change a system that worked so effectively from their perspective. That it required human suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale was simply the cost of doing business, a cost they were willing to pay because others bore the actual burden. But the very success of this system contained within it a threat that the Valyrians apparently never fully appreciated or chose to ignore. Mining on such a massive scale, digging deeper and deeper into volcanic mountains that were already geologically unstable, created stresses in the rock and in the magma chambers below. The ancient systems that kept the 14 flames in their delicate balance between active volcanism and catastrophic eruption were being disturbed by thousands of tunnels and chambers, by the removal of millions of tons of rock, by the constant weakening of the mountain structures. Some scholars, including Septon Barth, who studied Valyrian history extensively, speculated that the Valyrians used magical spells to control the 14 flames, keeping the volcanoes from erupting catastrophically, while still maintaining them as sources of heat and material. If this was true, and it seems likely given Valyrian magical capabilities, then these spells would have required constant maintenance and renewal. Any failure in these protective magics, any mistake or oversight, could have had catastrophic consequences. The Valyrians were essentially living on top of 14 active volcanoes, while simultaneously destabilizing them through mining, trusting in their magic to keep disaster at bay. Over the centuries, there must have been signs that this situation was unsustainable. Increased seismic activity, perhaps. Changes in the pattern of volcanic emissions. Minor eruptions that served as warnings of greater instability. But the Valyrians, in their pride and their certainty that their magic could control any threat, apparently dismissed these warnings or failed to recognize them for what they were. They had controlled the 14 flames for thousands of years. Why should they suddenly lose that control now? The slaves in the mines, closer to the source of the danger than any dragonlord in his palace, may have noticed changes that their masters dismissed. They would have felt the tremors, smelled the changes in the volcanic gases, noticed when passages that had been safe suddenly became dangerous. But who would listen to the warnings of slaves? Their testimony meant nothing in Valyrian society. They were tools, expendable and easily replaced. If they claimed the mountains were growing more dangerous, well, the mountains had always been dangerous. It changed nothing. The mining operation beneath the 14 Flames represented the Valyrian approach to power in microcosm. They would push any boundary, pay any price, risk any danger in pursuit of wealth and dominance. The suffering of others was irrelevant. The warnings of nature were ignored. The magical solution to every problem created dependencies and risks that went unacknowledged. And beneath all of it, literally and metaphorically, lay a foundation that was slowly crumbling, destabilized by the very actions that had made them powerful. When that foundation finally gave way, the entire edifice would come crashing down in fire and ruin. In the year that would later be remembered as 114 years before Aegon's conquest, or 12 years before the Doom, something extraordinary occurred in the House of Targaryen. Denys, the young maiden daughter of Lord Enar Targaryen, began experiencing dreams unlike any she had known before. These were not the ordinary dreams of sleep, the random firings of a mind at rest, but rather prophetic visions of terrible clarity and power. She saw Valyria burning. She saw the 14 Flames erupting in concert, tearing the peninsula apart. She saw dragons dying, thousands upon thousands of people perishing, the greatest civilization in the world destroyed in a single day of fire and fury. She woke from these dreams screaming, and when the visions continued night after night with increasing intensity, she finally went to her father. Denys the Dreamer, as she would later be known, was not the first or only Targaryen to experience prophetic dreams, but hers proved to be among the most significant in their family's history. The Targaryens, like many families of Valyrian blood, seemed to possess certain individuals in each generation who displayed heightened sensitivity to magic and fate. Some could bond with dragons more easily than others. Some showed particular aptitude for sorcery, and some, like Denys, received visions of what was to come. These gifts were never universal within the bloodline, suggesting that whatever quality enabled them was recessive or required specific circumstances to manifest. Lord Enar Targaryen faced a choice that would define his family's future. His daughter claimed to have seen the destruction of Valyria, a claim that seemed impossible. The freehold had stood for 5,000 years. It was the most powerful civilization in the known world, protected by hundreds of dragons and the greatest sorcerers ever known. How could such a power fall? The rational response would have been to dismiss Denys's visions as nightmares, perhaps to have her examined by blood mages who might help her manage these disturbing dreams. Many of the other Dragon Lord families, when word of her visions spread through the gossipy circles of Valyrian high society, did exactly this. They laughed at the Targaryens. They made jokes about prophetic ravings. Some apparently tried to use the situation to their advantage, suggesting that if the Targaryens were so worried they might want to sell their properties at bargain prices. But Enar Targaryen made a different choice. Whether he truly believed his daughter's visions, whether he saw them as warnings that prudence required heeding even if they proved false, or whether he had his own reasons for wanting to leave Valyria, he chose to act. He began quietly liquidating his family's holdings in the freehold and the lands of the Long Summer. This was no small undertaking. The Targaryens were an old family with extensive properties, investments, business arrangements, and connections throughout Valyrian society. Selling everything without causing panic or attracting too much attention required care and discretion. He had to find buyers, transfer deeds, collect debts, all while maintaining the appearance that this was simply normal business rather than preparation for departure. The destination Enar chose was Dragonstone, the Valyrian fortress colony that sat on a massive volcanic rock in the narrow sea, looking out toward the distant shores of Westeros. Dragonstone was remote by Valyrian standards, far from the center of power and influence, but it had several advantages. It was a Valyrian holding, so the Targaryens would not be completely abandoning their culture and heritage. It was defensible, carved from a single massive rock, with fortifications that made it nearly impregnable. It was large enough to support a noble household with all their dependents, and it was far enough from Valyria that if Dennis's visions proved true, they might survive. The migration was a massive undertaking. Enar brought his entire household, his family, his dragons, his slaves, his movable wealth, his most valued possessions. This was not a temporary relocation, but a permanent move, though he probably could not have explained this to most of those who accompanied him without revealing Daenerys' visions and inviting the mockery he was trying to avoid. The dragons alone would have made the journey complex. Transporting dragons over such distances requires either flying them, which limits what baggage they can carry and how many people can come along, or shipping them, which is dangerous and requires specially designed vessels. The Targaryens had 5 dragons at this time, including Balerion the Black Dread, who would later be ridden by Aegon the Conqueror. Other families of Valyrian blood also left the peninsula before the Doom, though whether inspired by their own profits or simply by coincidence is unclear. House Targaryen, who had been established on Driftmark, and House Celtigar of Claw Isle both survived because they were not in Valyria when the catastrophe struck. But these houses did not leave 12 years in advance. Their survival was more fortune than foresight. The Targaryens were the only major dragonlord family to receive clear warning and act upon it decisively. The question of why so few heeded warnings, assuming others also noticed signs of the coming disaster, leads into deeper mysteries about the nature of Valyrian society in its final years. There is some evidence in the fragmentary records that do survive that Valyria was experiencing internal problems before the Doom. Mentions of increased conflict between the dragonlord families appear in a few sources. There are vague references to magical difficulties, spells that weren't working as reliably as they once had, or predictions from blood mages that the future was becoming harder to read. Whether these were genuine omens of coming disaster, or simply the normal level of dysfunction in a complex society, is impossible to determine with certainty. The most disturbing theory, proposed by some scholars, though impossible to prove, is that some Valyrians did know disaster was coming, but were powerless or unwilling to prevent it. If the Doom was caused by magical systems failing, by spells that controlled the 14 flames breaking down, then those responsible for maintaining those spells would have known. Did they try to fix the problem and fail? Did they warn others and were ignored? Or did they keep silent, hoping to solve the issue without creating panic? We will never know, because anyone who might have answered these questions died in the conflagration. The Targaryens, safely on Dragonstone, had to watch as the years passed, and nothing happened. 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. As time went on without catastrophe, Dennis's visions must have seemed increasingly questionable. Perhaps they were just dreams after all, disturbing nightmares with no basis in reality. Let's say, other Dragonlord families certainly thought so. Messages arrived at Dragonstone. If the Targaryens maintained correspondence with the capital, possibly mocking them for their cowardice, or suggesting they had fled over nothing. The pressure to return, to reclaim their proper place in Valyrian society, must have been substantial. But Enar remained on Dragonstone. Whether he still believed in the visions or simply decided that having made the move he would not unmake it, he did not return. His decision to stay, to remain in what must have seemed like voluntary exile, saved his family and ensured that Dragonlord blood would survive beyond the Doom. The Targaryens on Dragonstone continued their lives, adapting to their new home, perhaps looking west toward Westeros and wondering about the lands across the water, not knowing that their descendants would eventually conquer those lands and rule them for nearly 3 centuries. Dennis the Dreamer's visions proved tragically, catastrophically accurate. 12 years after she saw the destruction in her dreams, 12 years after her father chose to believe her and flee, Valyria burned. Every Dragonlord family that had mocked the Targaryens, every house that had bought Targaryen properties at what they thought were bargain prices, every sorcerer and merchant and slave and citizen who had remained in the Freehold's capital, all of them died in a single day. The Targaryens, because of one girl's visions and one man's willingness to be called a coward rather than risk his family, were the only major Dragonlord house to survive. In the cruel arithmetic of history, the decision to flee made them the last Dragonlords, the sole inheritors of a tradition that had once included 40 great families. The day began like any other in the Valyrian freehold. The sun rose over the 14 flames, casting long shadows from the topless towers of the capital. Dragons took flight from their lairs, carrying riders on errands of trade or politics or pleasure. In the markets, merchants hawked their goods. In the palaces, Dragonlords schemed. In the mines beneath the mountains, slaves labored and died as they had for millennia. Nothing suggested that this day would be different from the 5,000 years that had come before. Nothing warned that by sunset, the greatest civilization the world had ever known would be gone. The exact sequence of events will never be fully known, because almost no one survived to record them, and those few who did were far from the center of the catastrophe. What can be reconstructed from fragmentary accounts, from the geological evidence visible in the ruins centuries later, and from the reports of survivors in distant parts of the freehold, suggests a cataclysm of unprecedented scale and fury. The Doom of Valyria was not a single event, but rather a cascade of disasters that compounded upon each other, each making the next worse, until the cumulative effect was the annihilation of everything within hundreds of miles of the capital. It began with the volcanoes. All 14 of the 14 flames erupted simultaneously, or near enough that the difference was academic for anyone trying to survive. This synchronicity strongly suggests that whatever caused the doom affected the volcanic system as a whole, rather than being a natural eruption of one volcano that triggered the others. Each volcano sent massive plumes of superheated ash and rock into the sky, columns that reached miles into the atmosphere. The ash was so thick it turned day into night across the entire region. Anyone breathing it directly would have died within minutes, their lungs seared and filled with volcanic debris. But the volcanic columns were merely the opening act. What followed was worse. Pyroclastic flows, cascades of superheated gas and rock fragments, rolled down the sides of the 14 flames at hundreds of miles per hour. Nothing could outrun these flows. They incinerated everything in their path, reducing stone buildings to rubble and people to ash in seconds. The temperature in these flows exceeded 1,000 degrees, hot enough that metal would melt and wood would spontaneously combust before the flow even reached it. The mountains themselves came apart. 5 centuries later, travelers who dared approach the ruins reported that the landscape had been fundamentally altered. Where once the Valyrian peninsula had been a continuous landmass, now it was fragmented into numerous smaller islands, separated by what came to be called the Smoking Sea. The violence required to shatter an entire peninsula suggests that the volcanic eruptions were accompanied by earthquakes of unimaginable magnitude, possibly triggered by the same cause, or perhaps triggered by the eruptions themselves, as the magma chambers beneath the mountains emptied in a catastrophic release. These earthquakes would have toppled even the magically reinforced structures of Valyria. The topless towers fell, their peaks lost in the ash clouds, even as their bases crumbled. Palaces built to last for millennia collapsed in minutes. The magical wards that had protected the city from the volcanic heat failed, or were simply overwhelmed by forces beyond their capacity to resist. Entire districts vanished into cracks that opened in the earth, or were buried under avalanches of volcanic material, or were inundated when the sea rushed in to fill the newly created basin where solid ground had been moments before. The molten rock that erupted from the 14 volcanoes flew 1,000 feet into the air, according to some accounts. This was not the relatively slow lava flow seen in gentler eruptions, but rather an explosive ejection of magma at velocities that defied description. The sky rained molten rock, dragonglass and fire. Buildings not yet destroyed by earthquakes or pyroclastic flows were set ablaze by this rain of fire. The heat was so intense that lakes boiled away in minutes, or worse, turned to acid through some combination of volcanic chemistry and possibly magical contamination. Anyone caught in the open was simply erased, burned to nothing so completely that not even bones remained. The dragons, those seemingly invincible creatures that had made Valyria the dominant power of the age, died. The texts say that dragonfire could not kill a dragon, that their scales resisted normal flame, but the doom was not normal fire. It was something unprecedented, a combination of volcanic heat, toxic gases, and possibly magical energies running wild as the spells that had controlled them for millennia all failed at once. Dragons fell from the sky, overcome by the poisonous atmosphere or killed by volcanic debris. Dragons in their lairs suffocated or were buried alive when the mountains collapsed. The hundreds of dragons that had been Valyria's ultimate weapon and ultimate symbol were reduced to corpses and bones, dead alongside their riders. The death toll defies estimation. The city of Valyria alone probably held hundreds of thousands of people, possibly more. The surrounding regions, the lands of the long summer, supported a much larger population. When the doom struck, everyone in the immediate vicinity died. Those slightly farther away, beyond the range of the initial pyroclastic flows and earthquakes, faced death from the ashfall, from the poisoning of water sources, from the collapse of all infrastructure that might have helped them survive. refugees fleeing the disaster carried stories of horror with them, tales of trying to run while the very ground split beneath their feet, of watching family members disappear into cracks in the earth or be consumed by fire from the sky, of escaping only because they happened to be on the edge of the destruction rather than at its center. The tsunamis generated by the Doom struck coastlines hundreds of miles away. When massive amounts of land suddenly drop or are destroyed, the sea rushes in to fill the void, and that creates waves of enormous size moving at tremendous speed. East of Valyria, the Isle of Cedars acted as a buffer that protected Slavers Bay from the worst of the waves. But the isle itself was devastated. The cities of Velos and Gozai on the Isle of Cedars were swept away completely, destroyed so thoroughly that they were never rebuilt. The isle has remained uninhabited ever since, a haunted place where no one wants to live. Other coastal regions reported waves that came without warning, walls of water that swept over harbors and low-lying areas, drowning thousands. Ships at sea reported being tossed about by swells that came from nowhere, and some vessels were simply never heard from again, presumably swamped by the chaotic seas that followed the Doom. The tsunamis extended the disaster's reach far beyond the immediate area of the volcanic eruptions, killing people who had no idea what had happened hundreds of miles away. The magical consequences of the Doom may have been as significant as the physical destruction. When Valyria died, magic throughout the world seemed to diminish. The glass candles went dark. Spells that had worked reliably for centuries stopped functioning or worked unreliably. In the Citadel in Westeros, Meisters who had been skeptical about magic pointed to this as proof that it had never been real, merely Valyrian tricks that ended when Valyria fell. But those who understood magic better recognized it differently. Valyria had been a nexus, a focal point where magical power concentrated. With that nexus destroyed, magic became more diffuse, harder to access, weaker in its manifestations. The smoke and ash from the Doom affected climate across the known world for months or possibly years afterward. The volcanic material ejected into the atmosphere reduced sunlight, causing what's sometimes called a volcanic winter. Crops failed, temperatures dropped, harvests were poor for several years running. This wasn't on the scale of the long night that had occurred thousands of years earlier, but it was significant enough to cause famines and unrest in regions far from Valyria itself. The Doom's effects thus reached literally everywhere, directly or indirectly touching every culture and kingdom. The Smoking Sea, created by the Doom and existing still in the present day, is a place of horror and mystery. The waters there are perpetually covered in mist and fog, heated from below by volcanic activity that continues centuries after the initial catastrophe. Ships that attempt to sail through the Smoking Sea often disappear or return with crews afflicted by strange diseases. The ruins of Valyria can be glimpsed through the mists, but they remain largely unexplored because approaching them is so dangerous. The region is said to be haunted, cursed, filled with horrors both natural and supernatural. What caused the Doom remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Several theories exist, none proven. The most common explanation is that it was a natural catastrophe, a coincidence of volcanic timing, where all 14 of the 14 flames happened to erupt at once. This seems unlikely given the improbability of such perfect synchronization, but it remains possible. Septon Barth and some Meisters theorized that Valyrian spells controlling the volcanoes failed, either through neglect or because the magical systems required for their maintenance had degraded over time. This seems more plausible, suggesting that the Valyrians' own hubris in trying to control such massive geological forces contributed to their destruction. Some religious figures, particularly septons of the Faith of the Seven, claimed that the Doom was divine punishment for Valyrian sins. They pointed to the practice of incest, to the blood magic, to the cruelties inflicted on slaves, to the general godlessness of Valyrian society as evidence that the gods had finally brought judgment upon them. Whether one accepts supernatural explanations or not, the moralizing response tells us something about how the Doom was received by others, with a mixture of horror at the scale of destruction and a certain grim satisfaction that the mighty had been brought low. A more disturbing theory, supported by fragmentary evidence, suggests that enemies of Valyria might have somehow caused the Doom through magical sabotage. The idea that someone could weaponize volcanic systems on such a scale seems far-fetched, but in a world where magic exists, can it be entirely dismissed? If the Valyrians used spells to control the 14 flames, then it follows that those spells might be vulnerable to magical attack. Whether any enemy possessed both the knowledge and power to exploit such vulnerability remains unknown. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the Doom was the result of Valyrian magical experimentation going catastrophically wrong. If they were trying something new, pushing magical boundaries as they had always done, they might have triggered a cascade effect that destroyed everything. This would be fitting in a grim way. The civilization that built itself through reckless pursuit of power, ultimately destroyed by that same recklessness. Whatever the cause, the result was clear and devastating. In a single day, the greatest civilization the world had known was erased. Valyria fell from the height of its power to utter annihilation with no warning and no chance to save itself. The topless towers became ruins. The dragons died. The dragonlord families were extinguished. 5,000 years of history, of magical knowledge, of artistic achievement, all of it was lost. The Doom of Valyria stands as perhaps the single most catastrophic day in the history of the known world, a cataclysm that changed everything that came after and left scars that remain visible centuries later. In the immediate aftermath of the Doom, as the ash settled and the survivors tried to comprehend what had happened, a power vacuum of unprecedented scale opened across Essos. The Valyrian freehold had ruled half the known world for thousands of years. It had provided stability, however brutal, and a clear hierarchy of power. Now that hierarchy was gone, shattered as completely as the Valyrian peninsula itself. The colonies, the subject peoples, the tributary states, all suddenly found themselves without masters and without the protection that those masters had provided. What followed was a century of constant warfare and upheaval that history would remember as the Century of Blood. The immediate crisis was simple. Who would control the vast territories that had been the freehold? The obvious candidates were the remaining Valyrian colonies, particularly the largest and most powerful ones. These cities were Valyrian in culture and governance, spoke High Valyrian, maintained many of the traditions and practices of the old freehold. They had the infrastructure, the wealth, the institutional knowledge to potentially hold together at least part of what had been lost. But they also had conflicting ambitions and no overarching authority to settle disputes between them. Volantis, the first and greatest of the Valyrian colonies, believed it was the natural successor to the freehold. Located strategically at the mouth of the Rhoyne, Volantis had been founded early in Valyrian expansion and had grown into a massive city, possibly the largest in the world after the destruction of Valyria itself. Its ruling class, known as the Tigers, took their name from their aggressive foreign policy. They reasoned that since Volantis was the oldest and greatest of the colonies, it should naturally inherit the freehold's position as the dominant power of Essos. The Tigers embarked on an ambitious campaign to reconstitute the Valyrian freehold under Volantene control. They sent their armies west and east, attempting to bring the other free cities back under centralized authority. For a time, they achieved significant success. Volantis was wealthy, possessed a large military, and could call upon institutional memory of Valyrian military tactics. But the enterprise was ultimately doomed by the same factor that makes all empires fragile: the need for constant military success. Each conquered city required a garrison to hold it. Each campaign stretched supply lines. And critically, every other free city resisted Volantene ambitions, seeing no reason why they should bow to Volantis when the old freehold was gone. The coalition wars that followed saw various combinations of free cities allying against Volantene expansion. Bravos, Pentos, Myr, Tir Roche, Lys, all at different times, fought to preserve their independence. The wars were brutal and destructive, fought by armies that included sellsword companies, slave legions, and whatever dragons had survived the Doom or been elsewhere when it occurred. The battles ravaged the disputed territories, with cities changing hands multiple times, populations being massacred or enslaved, and infrastructure being repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt. Volantis ultimately failed in its bid to restore the freehold. The turning point came during major defeats at the hands of the coalition that had formed to oppose them. Exhausted by constant warfare, facing enemies on multiple fronts, and lacking the overwhelming advantage that dragons had provided to the old freehold, Volantis was forced to accept that it could not reconquer the former empire. The Tigers fell from power temporarily, replaced by the Elephants, a political faction that favored trade over conquest. Volantis remained powerful, but accepted its position as one of several major free cities rather than a new imperial capital. While the free cities fought among themselves in the west, the former colonies in the east faced their own crises. The cities of Slavers Bay, Astapor, Meereen, and Yunkai had been under Valyrian dominance for 5,000 years. Now, suddenly, they were independent. The question was what form that independence would take. Would they rebuild as free states? Would they maintain the Giscari traditions that had survived under Valyrian rule? Or would they continue as slave cities, perpetuating the system that had oppressed them, but that had also become integral to their economies? The answer, tragically, was the latter. The cities of Slavers Bay maintained slavery as the foundation of their societies, though they slowly began to reassert what remained of Giscari culture. They spoke Giscari dialects again, rather than pure High Valyrian, though their language had been so thoroughly influenced by Valyrian that it could never be the same as it had been before the conquest. They rebuilt some of their traditional architecture, the massive pyramids that had characterized Old Guise, but they remained fundamentally dependent on slavery, particularly the slave trade that connected the eastern and western portions of what had been the freehold. Into the power vacuum came the Dothraki, nomadic horse lords from the plains to the east who had previously been kept in check by Valyrian military power. With the freehold destroyed and the successor states preoccupied with fighting each other, the Dothraki began raiding westward in massive khalasars. They sacked cities, burned croplands, enslaved thousands, and generally made the eastern regions of Essos unsafe for settled civilization. Multiple cities and even entire peoples were wiped out by Dothraki raids during the Century of Blood. The Sarnori, a civilization of chariot riders whose cities lay east of the Free Cities, were particular victims of Dothraki expansion. City after city fell to the Horse Lords, their populations scattered or killed. By the end of the Century of Blood, the Sarnori civilization was effectively extinct, reduced to ruins and legends. They had been a significant power during the Valyrian period, but without the Valyrians to protect them, or at least keep the Dothraki in check, they proved unable to defend themselves. Piracy flourished during this period as well. With no overarching naval power to police the seas, pirates established bases throughout the islands and coastlines of Essos. Trade became dangerous, with merchants requiring armed escorts for even short voyages. Some pirates became powerful enough to threaten small cities or demand tribute from coastal settlements. A few established themselves as semi-legitimate powers, their pirate kingdoms holding territory and engaging in diplomacy alongside their raiding. The slave trade, far from diminishing after the Doom, actually increased. With constant warfare creating refugees and captives, the markets of Slavers' Bay were flooded with merchandise. The mines of the 14 Flames were gone, but the demand for slave labor in other contexts remained. Agriculture, especially in the free cities that relied on plantation crops, required large amounts of labor. Households of wealthy merchants and nobles needed servants. The galleys that conducted trade and warfare needed rowers. Every conflict produced captives who could be sold into slavery, and every sale funded further conflict. Among all this chaos, some positive developments occurred. Braavos, the secret city that had been founded by escaped slaves and had hidden its existence for over a century, finally revealed itself openly. With the freehold destroyed, Braavos no longer needed to fear discovery and punishment. The city entered into diplomatic relations with other powers and became a significant player in Essos politics. The Braavosi, with their relatively egalitarian society and their ban on slavery, represented a different path than the other free cities, though their influence was limited by their relatively late emergence as an open power. The Century of Blood eventually ended not through any single peace agreement or decisive victory, but through gradual exhaustion. The various powers realized that continued warfare was destroying their ability to function economically, and that the benefits of trade and stable borders outweighed the potential gains from continued conflict. Alliances became less fluid, borders more stable, trade routes more secure. The free cities settled into an equilibrium where each retained independence but acknowledged certain spheres of influence. Slavers' Bay became the dominant slave trading region, with the three cities cooperating more often than they competed. The Dothraki khalasars continued raiding but were increasingly avoided or bought off, rather than confronted directly. The most significant long-term consequence of the Century of Blood was the permanent fragmentation of what had been the Valyrian freehold. There would be no new empire to replace it. Instead, Essos became a complex patchwork of independent cities, minor kingdoms, nomadic peoples, and dangerous wastelands. The unity that Valyria had imposed, however brutal, was gone forever. Trade became more complicated, requiring negotiations with multiple powers rather than operating under a single system. Culture began to diverge as the various regions developed their own identities rather than conforming to Valyrian standards. Magic continued to fade during this period. Without the nexus of power that Valyria had represented, without the constant practice and systematic study that Valyrian blood mages had performed, magical knowledge diminished, skills were lost, spells stopped working or were forgotten. By the end of the Century of Blood, magic was widely regarded as dead or dying, something that had existed in the past but was no longer a significant force in the world. The glass candles remained dark. The few dragons that had survived the doom elsewhere eventually died, and no one could hatch new ones. Magic became a matter of stories and histories rather than a practical concern. The Century of Blood demonstrated that while Valyria could be destroyed, the consequences of its existence could not be erased. The systems it had established, the dependencies it had created, the migrations it had caused, all of these persisted. The slave economies of Slavers' Bay continued because no one knew how to run those societies without slavery. The free cities maintained Valyrian cultural elements because that was their heritage, for better or worse. The scars of Valyrian conquest remained visible across Essos in ruined cities, altered landscapes, and populations that carried Valyrian blood or language. When the chaos finally subsided and the world began to stabilize again, it was clear that an age had ended. The era of Valyrian dominance was over. The age that followed would be defined by political fragmentation, by the gradual diminishment of magic, by societies trying to rebuild on the ruins of what had been lost. It was a smaller world in many ways, less connected, less ambitious, less certain of its power to reshape reality. The giants had fallen, and what remained were merely humans trying to survive in a world that had been made for giants. 4 centuries after the Doom, the ruins of Valyria remain forbidden territory, avoided by all but the most desperate or foolhardy. The smoking sea that now covers much of what was once the Valyrian Peninsula is perpetually shrouded in mists, heated from below by volcanic activity that continues unabated. Ships that attempt to navigate these waters often disappear without trace, and those that do return carry crews afflicted with grayscale, madness, or other afflictions. The very air in the region is said to be toxic, poisoned by something more than simple volcanic gases. Some believe the area is cursed, that the ghosts of the millions who died there still linger, angry and malevolent. The few travelers who have glimpsed the ruins through the mists speak of impossible sights. Buildings that somehow still stand despite 4 centuries of neglect and geological violence, preserved perhaps by the same magic that created them. Dragons, or creatures that look like dragons, flying through the ash-choked sky above the ruins. Things moving in the mist that do not appear to be human or animal, but something else. Possibly the chimeras that survived when their creators perished, or possibly something worse. These reports are treated with skepticism by rational people, but enough sailors and adventurers have told similar stories that there's likely some truth beneath the exaggeration. The most dramatic evidence of the danger comes from documented attempts to reclaim treasures from the ruins. Geryon Lannister, a younger brother of Tywin Lannister, journeyed to Valyria seeking to recover Brightroar, the lost Valyrian steel sword of a House Lannister. He sailed from Lannisport with a ship full of hired swords and dreams of glory. Neither the ship nor any of its crew were ever seen again, presumably lost to whatever dangers lurk in the smoking sea. The Lannister family still officially considers him missing rather than dead, but everyone knows the truth. Valyria claimed him as it has claimed so many others. Euron Greyjoy claimed to have sailed to Valyria and returned, displaying a dragon horn that he said came from the ruins. Whether his claim was true or an elaborate deception remains debatable, but if he did venture to Valyria and survive, it would make him one of very few to do so. His willingness to risk such a journey speaks to either incredible bravery or tremendous madness, possibly both. More officially, Volantis once sent a fleet to attempt to reclaim Valyria, to reassert control over the ruins and claim whatever treasures might still exist there. The fleet sailed into the smoking sea and was never heard from again. Every ship, every soldier, every sailor simply vanished. Volantis did not send another expedition. The lesson was clear. Valyria's destruction was so complete, its ruins so dangerous, that even 4 centuries later they remained effectively impregnable. The most terrifying account of what might exist in the ruins comes from the story of Princess Aeria Targaryen and Balerion, the Black Dread. In the year 56 after Aegon's conquest, Princess Aeria, who had claimed Balerion as her mount despite being a young and inexperienced rider, disappeared for more than a year. When she finally reappeared in King's Landing, she was dying. Grand Maester Bennifer and Septon Bath examined her and found her body infested with creatures that defied description. Worms with faces, snakes with hands, things that burned her from the inside out even as they killed her. Bath concluded that Balerion, uncontrollable by his young rider, had flown to his birthplace in Valyria. While there, both dragon and rider were exposed to something that should not exist. The creatures that killed Princess Aeria were speculated to be remnants of Valyrian blood magic experiments, chimeras or worse that survived in the ruins. Balerion himself returned with wounds and scars that proved even the mightiest dragon could be harmed by whatever dwelt in Valyria's remains. After this incident, it was decreed that any ship suspected of having visited Valyria would be forbidden from docking in Westeros. Despite the dangers and the centuries of neglect, the ruins almost certainly still contain treasures that would be invaluable to the present age. Valyrian steel weapons of unknown number lie somewhere in the collapsed palaces and buried vaults. The Valyrians hoarded spellbooks, magical artifacts, precious metals, works of art, all the accumulated wealth of 5,000 years. Most of it would have been destroyed in the Doom, or is inaccessible beneath volcanic debris or the smoking sea. But surely some survived in sealed chambers or protected vaults. Anyone who could safely retrieve even a fraction of what remains would become immediately wealthy beyond measure. The magical knowledge lost with Valyria represents perhaps the greatest tragedy from a scholarly perspective. The Valyrians had systematized magic, turning it into a science with predictable rules and repeatable results. Their understanding of blood magic, fire magic, the creation of Valyrian steel, the taming of dragons, the construction of magical structures, all of this knowledge died with them. Later civilizations have attempted to rediscover these secrets through experimentation, studying old texts or examining surviving artifacts, but they work with fragmentary information and can never fully reconstruct what was lost. The only exception is Korhor, where the master smiths retain the ability to rework Valyrian steel, though not to create it anew from raw materials. How Korhor preserved this knowledge when it was lost everywhere else remains a mystery. Whatever the reason, Korhoric smiths are the only ones in the world who can rework Valyrian steel. making them invaluable despite their secrecy. The political legacy of Valyria extends beyond the physical ruins and lost knowledge. The Targaryen conquest of Westeros, which reshaped that continent's history for 3 centuries, was a direct consequence of the Doom. The Targaryens on Dragonstone, isolated and possessing the last major flight of dragons in the world, eventually decided to use those dragons to conquer the 7 kingdoms. Aegon's conquest established a dynasty that would rule until Robert's rebellion, influencing every aspect of Westerosi culture and politics. The Iron Throne itself, forged from 1,000 swords by dragonfire, stands as a monument to Valyrian power transplanted to a new land. The free cities that arose from Valyrian colonies continue to influence events in the present day. Their wealth, their culture, their conflicts, all trace roots back to their Valyrian origins. High Valyrian is still spoken by the educated classes throughout Essos, though it has evolved into various dialects in different regions. The architectural styles pioneered by Valyrian builders still influence construction in the free cities. The practice of slavery, adopted from Guise but embraced by Valyria, continues in Slavers' Bay and elsewhere despite being the source of constant conflict. The return of magic to the world, marked by the hatching of Daenerys Targaryen's dragon eggs, suggests that somehow the connection between dragons and magical power that characterize Valyria remains relevant. When her dragons were born, the glass candles in the citadel lit for the first time in centuries. Warlocks in Karth suddenly found their powers increased. Red priests began speaking with confidence about prophecies and visions that had been unclear or absent. The world felt the presence of dragons again and responded as if waking from a long sleep. The lesson of Valyria, if there is one, seems to be about hubris and the price of ambition unchecked by wisdom. The Valyrians reached heights of power and accomplishment unmatched before or since. They tamed dragons, worked magic as science, built cities that defied natural law, and ruled half the known world. But they achieved this through methods that required constant expansion, constant exploitation, constant pushing of boundaries both geological and moral. They lived atop volcanoes while destabilizing them through mining. They practiced magic that required blood sacrifice. They built a society where magnificence coexisted with monstrous cruelty. And ultimately, whether through divine judgment, natural catastrophe, magical failure, or their own recklessness, they were destroyed so completely that their very name became synonymous with hubris and fall. The Valyrian steel blades that survive in the present day serve as physical reminders of what was lost. These swords, passed down through noble families in Westeros and beyond, are treasured not just for their practical qualities, but for what they represent, a connection to an age when humanity seemed capable of achieving anything it desired. The fact that no one can create new Valyrian steel emphasizes the irreversibility of the loss. Some knowledge, once lost, cannot be recovered through effort or study. The survivors of Valyrian blood, who scattered throughout the world after the Doom, carried with them fragments of what had been. The Targaryens, obviously, but also lesser families, individuals who could trace ancestry back to dragonlords or Valyrian colonists. In Lys, the Lysini are descended partly from Valyrian settlers and still displays some of the characteristic features: the silver gold hair, the purple eyes, the fair complexion. In Volantis, the old blood families who live within the Black Walls maintain Valyrian ancestry and traditions. These scattered remnants keep alive certain cultural practices, certain words and customs, certain memories of the civilization that birthed them. But ultimately, these are just echoes, fragments of something that can never be fully restored. The Valyrian freehold was not merely a political entity, but an entire civilization, a way of understanding the world and humanity's place in it. When it fell, something genuinely irreplaceable was lost. Subsequent civilizations have built on Valyrian foundations, used Valyrian technologies, spoken Valyrian languages, but none have been Valyria. None could be. The ruins stand as a warning as much as a loss. Every ambitious ruler who dreams of conquering the world, every sorcerer who seeks to push magical boundaries, every civilization that believes itself invincible and eternal, should remember Valyria. Remember that the greatest power the world had known was destroyed in a single day. Remember that all the dragons and all the magic and all the might meant nothing when catastrophe struck. Remember that hubris is not punished by gods or fate, but by the natural consequences of reaching too far without understanding what one is reaching for. Yet there is also inspiration in the Valyrian story, despite its horrific ending. They dared to attempt the impossible and often succeeded. They showed that human ambition, for all its dangers, can achieve wonders. The Valyrian steel that survived them is still the finest metal ever forged. The dragons they tamed became legends that inspired dreams for centuries. The magical knowledge they accumulated, even though most of it was lost, suggested possibilities that continue to fascinate scholars and sorcerers. And so, we reach the end of our journey through the complete history of Old Valyria, from shepherds to conquerors to ruins beneath poisoned seas. We have witnessed the discovery of dragons in volcanic depths and the transformation of a people that discovery caused. We have walked through the magnificent capital, with its topless towers and magical wonders built on foundations of blood and slavery. We have observed the wars that established Valyrian dominance, the brutal annihilation of civilizations that dared resist. We have explored the dark heart of Valyrian magic, the blood, sacrifices, and flesh-twisting experiments that pushed beyond all moral boundaries. We have descended into the minis where countless slaves died to fuel Valyrian glory. We have stood with Dennis the Dreamer as she warned her father of coming disaster, watched the Targaryens flee while others mocked them, and then witnessed the terrible validation of her visions as the doom consumed everything in a single day of fire beyond imagining. We have survived through the century of blood that followed, observing the chaos that erupts when a dominant power suddenly vanishes. And we have examined the legacy that persists 4 centuries later, the ruins that remain forbidden, the knowledge that was lost, the influences that continue to shape the world despite Valyria's absence. This history speaks to universal themes that transcend the specific details of dragons and magic. It reminds us that even the mightiest civilizations are temporary, that power corrupts when wielded without wisdom, that ambition must be tempered by understanding of limits. The Valyrians achieved wonders we can barely comprehend and committed atrocities we can barely stomach. They were human in their brilliance and human in their flaws, magnified to an extraordinary scale by the power they commanded. The complete story of Valyria is not simple. It cannot be reduced to heroes or villains, to triumph or tragedy alone. It was both and neither. A civilization that defies easy moral judgment, precisely because it achieved so much while causing so much suffering, because it pushed boundaries of knowledge and power in ways that were simultaneously admirable and horrifying. Understanding Valyria requires holding multiple truths in tension. They were magnificent and monstrous, visionary and blind, powerful and fragile, eternal and suddenly gone. Thank you for joining me on this deep exploration of Valyria's complete history. If you found value in this journey through one of the most fascinating civilizations in fantasy literature, then I would be deeply grateful if you would take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are countless other stories waiting to be told, other corners of this magnificent world to explore, other lessons to be drawn from the legends that have captivated millions. Together, we will continue to uncover these treasures, one tale at a time, keeping alive the wonder and wisdom that stories can provide. Until next time, may your path be lit by knowledge, may your curiosity never fade, and may you always remember that the greatest civilizations leave their marks, not just in what they built, but in what they taught those who come after. The story of Valyria is never truly over, as long as we remember it and learn from it. Good night, and may you find wisdom in the ashes of glory.